I'm delighted to welcome you all to Lake Forest College for an evening with Trever Potter on money and politics. His talk on this very important subject is jointly sponsored by three organizations: the League of Women Voters of the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area, the Stevenson Center on Democracy, and Lake Forest College. And I'm on the faculty of the college. My name is Carol Gale. To start off, I'd like to introduce Adlai Stevenson III, the chairman of the Stevenson Center. He will welcome you, but before we do that, let me point out that the Stevenson Center has a program this Sunday at 2 p.m. out at their St. Mary's, Libertyville, at the Stevenson Farm. And it is the Consul General of China in Chicago, and his topic is the Sino-U.S. relationship for the new era. And that, of course, is a major topic. So first let me introduce Wen Kane, who's president of the League of Women Voters, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Wen Kane, president of the Lake Forest League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. The League is pleased to be able to provide this evening's program, Money in Politics, Democracy and Governance in Today's America, with Trever Potter. The program is being co-sponsored by the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy and Lake Forest College, and we are all delighted you could join us for this evening's important discussion. The League is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse or support any political parties or candidates. We work at the national, state, and local levels to increase understanding of major public policy issues and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. Membership is open to both men and women. We offer a variety of activities throughout the year: voter registration, candidate debates, public programs, and discussion groups. If you're interested in public policy issues or being engaged in the political process, please think of joining us. We have brochures, membership forms at the back tables. Or you go to our website to get more information and follow us on Facebook. Before we start this evening's program, I want you to know about our upcoming program, Saturday, May 20th, entitled Your Child's Health: The Impact of Climate Change, Healthcare, and Gun Safety. Dr. Ann Edwards of the American Academy of Pediatrics will discuss how scientific findings impact public policy and the health and development of children. Watch for more information about this program in the media and on our website. This evening's program is being videotaped by Lake Forest TV and will be shown on channels 17 and 19 in Lake Forest, on our website, or on YouTube. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Carol Gale. She's both our League co-vice president of program and the college director of community education and associate professor of history. Carol?
So I'm back again, and the first thing I have to do is correct what I announced about the program on China's American relations. It is Sunday, May 21st. That is a week from this coming Sunday. So I'm sorry to have given you the wrong information. The Sino-U.S. relationship in the new era. But now what I'd like to do is to introduce Adlai Stevenson III. It's a great honor to be able to do so. As you all, I hope, know, he was born into a family deeply committed to political service, and he himself has served the public weal with great distinction. As a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, and then he was Illinois State Treasurer, and then served in the U.S. Senate for a decade. He was also twice the candidate for governor in the 1980s. Senator Stevenson, we're honored to have you with us.
Thank you, Carol. As Carol mentioned, I'm here as chairman of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy, which is headquartered just a few miles from here at the family home, which is now a historic landmark. It's just off on St. Mary's Road off I-60, and our next meeting is, as you mentioned, May 21. We have these monthly meetings at the home in our lecture hall. The next one will feature the Chinese Consul General on U.S.-China relations. Occasionally we have meetings downtown, big meetings, one of which was addressed once by Trevor Potter. But now we're focused on the agenda for political reform, a very comprehensive agenda addressing all branches and levels of government, state, local, you name it. Everything from redistricting to electoral college to campaign finance to selection of state judges. It's part of our agenda, and the objective is to create a coalition that brings together all of the good government groups, all the reformers together on the same page, to unite them behind not the centers, but the coalition's agenda for political reform. And we're having our first organizing meeting in Washington, late May, where the League of Women Voters has signed on. And guess who's hosting the meeting? Trevor Potter. Thank you, Carol. Thank you all.
So you may have noticed that when you came in, you were offered a little index card, and during the session, league volunteers will be walking up and down the aisles, and there's one over there now, with cards, and one there, with cards and pencils, and those are for you to write down questions that you would like to address to Mr. Potter. So we're very pleased to have Trevor Potter with us tonight. He's a lawyer of distinction with specialties in campaign finance and election law, and he is a man who's won praise from the American Bar Association and a whole armful of legal organizations. He brings wide experience in government and politics to the subject at hand. After working for the Justice Department and then the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, Mr. Potter served as commissioner of the Federal Election Commission, chairing the commission in 1994. He was Deputy General Counsel to the George H.W. Bush campaign in 1988 and General Counsel to the presidential campaigns of John McCain in 2000 and 2008. Mr. Potter is deeply concerned with what the American Bar Association has called the delicate intersection of politics, law, and money. He speaks frequently on the topic in an effort to widen public awareness. You may have seen him on the Colbert Report in 2011 when he explained to Colbert and his audience the complexities and weaknesses of campaign finance law. And then he served as Colbert's lawyer when the latter set up his own super PAC, which is, I'm sure, an unusual. So although we're not Stephen Colbert, we are the several organizations in Lake Forest, Illinois, and we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I have to say that I'm always worried when I am introduced with a Colbert reference, because I know that raises your expectations, so let me lower them for you by quoting what I was told as I was ready to go on for the very first Colbert show that I did, and the woman who had been shepherding me through the process was standing there. I was behind this curtain. She was about to shove me forward onto the stage in the middle of the show, and I'd been told where to sit. And she leaned over and she said, "Just remember, he's the funny one." Alas, it's true. So we'll have a good conversation tonight, but do not expect that I will have the natural wit and humor that Mr. Colbert does. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. To some extent back for me, because I grew up in Chicago and Libertyville and spent lots of time in Lake Forest, and I see old friends in the audience, so that's a real treat. I had grown up always hearing about the Stevenson farm, and it took becoming an adult and coming back for Senator Stevenson and Nancy to take me out and show me around. It's a wonderful spot, and I hope those of you who don't know it will have a chance to go to events there and get the feel of history when it was the center of much of American politics for a number of years. And of course, the League of Women Voters I have worked with in Washington over the years, and always found incredibly professional, incredibly devoted and hardworking. So when the Lake Forest League asked me to come and talk tonight, I accepted with alacrity. The extra dollop on top of it all, of course, is that I left Washington when it was gray and rainy and cold, and what a pleasant surprise to discover that your weather is considerably better than that. So, and I thank Lake Forest College for hosting this. You were kind to do it. I think a little bit as now a Virginia resident of what Thomas Jefferson would feel about me giving a talk on politics in a chapel, since he famously believed in the separation of church and state, but I'm hoping he would at least approve of the message tonight, which is to talk about the health of our democracy. Here we are in mid-May, and I think we may be just starting to assimilate the November election. Now, I'm not talking about who won. That's a different speech. I'm talking about where we are in terms of campaign practices and campaign finance. The amount of money that was raised in the last cycle, by whom and how, and whether the concerns that were so clearly and deeply felt by the American public about the role of special interests in Washington, about corruption, about draining the swamp, whether those concerns will be acted on either in Donald Trump's Washington or in the states. So let's start by looking at the numbers. $6.5 billion. That's how much the federal election cycle cost in last year for federal offices alone. Spending in federal elections has skyrocketed in recent years, up from only $2.5 billion in 2000. That's a 260% increase in 4 election cycles. This record spending came despite the fact that the 2016 Trump campaign relied heavily on free media coverage to an unprecedented degree, and therefore spent less money than Mitt Romney had done 4 years earlier. Now, take a look at this number. That is the estimated value of the amount of free media coverage that Donald Trump got in the primary season and in the general election. And particularly in the primaries, wherever you turned, that's what the programming was on cable television. Now, that is the comparison to how much free media coverage Hillary Clinton got. So you can see there was a disparity there. Clinton spent more money on her campaign, but that was largely to buy advertising and get her message out, and Trump was getting his message out at twice the rate for free. Meanwhile, congressional races were more expensive than ever in the last election, with $4 billion of spending in those races. That's up from 2012, and it's up from 2008, where it was only $2.5 billion. So if you look at that chart, you can see a really steady increase in the cost of congressional races. over the last number of years. Where is all this money coming from? The answer is only a tiny fraction of our population. The FEC, by law, has a database, and when someone makes a contribution to a candidate of more than $200, that contribution is in the FEC database. And that's true if you write a $500 check. That's true if you contribute $50 4 times. It aggregates 200. It goes into the FEC database. That is so if you give to a candidate, a party committee, or a PAC, an organization that spends money in federal elections. So having said all that, you have this FEC database, people who are active in American politics at what is, I suspect this room would consider a minimum level of $200 to any candidate or party committee over an entire 2-year cycle. What's your guess on what percentage of Americans meet that basic standard of participation and are therefore in the database? Any ideas? 5%, 3%, 10, 1, somebody's a skeptic out there. So there's your number. Half of 1%. So by definition, 99.5% of Americans are not participating in federal elections at what is the minimal entry level to be recognized by the FEC. And that includes the PACs and the parties as well. So here is another number. That is 1/100th of 1%, and that is the number of donors, Americans, 200 of them, who gave $1 billion of the $6.5 billion spent on the last election cycle. Most of this money went to independent outside groups because those groups can take unlimited donations. For instance, super PACs raised $1.8 billion last cycle, almost 1/3 of all the spending in the election. And the top 1% of their donors gave 77% of that super PAC money. So we're talking about a very small number of Americans who are these major funders of our candidates and parties and of the election information we receive. Now, we know all of this about super PACs and candidates because they have to disclose their donors, and they're in that FEC database, and you can go home and look them up. But all too often, we don't actually know who is funding the advertising we're seeing. As the money has poured into our elections, federal agencies like the Federal Election Commission, where I used to serve, and the IRS have, for a variety of reasons, done almost nothing to enforce the laws that require disclosure of the sources of political spending. So we now have a phenomenon the press calls dark money, which is advertising whose source we can't identify because it's coming through tax-exempt groups that don't have to disclose their donors. If you, let's see, which one is that? That's the slide that shows you the total outside spending with no disclosure of donors. And what you will see is back in 2004, there was only $5.8 million of that, and today we are up at $184 million. That high number in 2012 is because both the Obama side and particularly the Romney side had a lot of donors who gave dark money for presidential advertising. This time there were relatively few people who gave for Trump advertising. Groups like the Koch brothers instead spent most of it on close Senate races. That's, as you look at this chart, 36 times today the amount of dark money that there was before the Citizens United decision. And for those of you who don't know that decision, it's the ruling by the Supreme Court that corporations have a constitutional right to spend money in elections. Not just federal elections, but Lake Forest town and school board elections if they want as well. Now, I'm mentioning all these numbers because they illustrate a broader issue with the way we fund our elections. And that issue is Americans don't like what we're doing. Secret money, unlimited contributions by a handful of billionaires to super PACs, average voters swamped with negative TV advertising from unaccountable, often unknown groups. The vast majority of the American people recognize all of this as a problem. The Citizens United decision in particular has ignited anger about money in politics in a way we haven't seen in a long time. Let me give you a sense of this in terms of what polls tell us Americans are thinking. So there are two numbers, 81% and 84%. Those are the percentages of Republicans and Democrats who agree with the following statements. Quote, "There are some good things in the system for funding political campaigns, but fundamental changes are needed." Or, more strongly, "The system for funding political campaigns has so much wrong with it that we need to completely rebuild it." So 81% of Republicans, 84% of Democrats agree with one of those two statements. So those are the statements. If 81% of Republicans, 84% of Democrats think that our system needs to be rebuilt or needs fundamental change, you would think something might happen, particularly when you look at this number. And that's the percentage of independents who agree with those statements. And then there's this number. That's the percentage of Americans who tell pollsters that things are just fine, we don't need to do anything. So on one subject at least, everyone agrees we need to do something. These overwhelming majorities. So what is it exactly that causes Americans to think we need to change? What is it they dislike about our current system? Those are the percentages of Americans who think government is corrupt. Republicans more skeptical than Democrats. But what do Americans mean when we talk about corruption? What is it that they're objecting to? The answer is people, and you heard this in the Trump campaign, and I'll come back and talk about this, people think the system is rigged against the average American by the special interests who seem to control the political process. 79% of Americans say the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. And then there's one that I find fascinating. 87% of Americans agree that we should have reform so that a rich person does not have more influence than a person without money. That's a pretty remarkable number given how we actually finance our election systems. People are objecting to a government which, in theory, we have responsibility for. We have elected these people to office. They're our representatives, and they're only there because of us. Even so, we have these huge majorities of Americans who think our government is no longer responsive. Now, candidate Trump understood this frustration. He gained traction in the presidential race, I think in significant part by talking about what he called the rigged system in Washington. He spoke specifically about the problem of money in politics, how he knew that big donors would write checks so politicians would do favors, because he said he had done it himself. He said that Washington only works for the special interests, not for the people, and he would change this. Polls show this was a big part of his appeal to voters across the country, and not surprising when you see those numbers of Americans who are unhappy with the system. And people are not wrong to worry about special interest influence. When Ronald Reagan was first in office, lobbyists reported spending around $200 million a year for lobbying activities. Last year, lobbyists spent $3.1 billion in reporting spending. That is, by comparison, larger than the entire budget of the Congress of the United States. In fact, being a lobbyist is now so appealing that about 1/2 of former senators and 1/3 of former House members leave Congress to become registered lobbyists. And because the registration rules for lobbyists are lax, the number that is actually being paid to influence their former colleagues is undoubtedly higher than that. Well, what is it these lobbyists do in Washington? Lots of things, but for our purpose tonight, it's important to recognize that one of their jobs is to make campaign contributions to incumbent members of Congress and to hold fundraisers for them to raise money for the re-election of the same members they are lobbying. How does that affect that whole system? How does that affect the members of Congress themselves? Well, here is a particularly interesting figure. This figure comes from a leaked PowerPoint slide at a briefing that was put on by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for the new members of Congress, the people who had arrived full of idealism. They'd made it through a horrible election. They were ready to get down to work. And their party committee told them that they should spend 40% of their days in Washington fundraising. They had this neat slide here that shows 4 hours of call time, which is the euphemism for fundraising, as well as constituent visits, a little bit of committee floor work, recharge time, so forth. But the biggest chunk is going to be call time. That is done, they're not allowed to do it in their offices, so that is done in the basements of party headquarters, where they go into little booths and put on headphones and call complete strangers to ask them for money. Every once in a while, calling people who have actually given before and maybe someone they've met before. We've now reached the point where money has become so singularly important in winning elections that this model schedule is what new members do at a minimum. I was told by one member of Congress that she laughed when she saw this number because she spent at least 6 hours fundraising a day, and she had never so much appreciated the fact that California was on a different time schedule because she could go to a dinner reception and then go back and make more calls after dinner to the West Coast. Now, legislators of both parties, not surprisingly, complain and think this is a terrible system. Chris Murphy, a Democratic senator from Connecticut, put it this way: "Today, more than ever before, the one question you have to ask when you are deciding whether to run for the United States House or the United States Senate is, are you willing to become a telemarketer for 24 months? On the other side of the political spectrum, Congressman Ken Buck, a Republican and member of the House Freedom Caucus, just came out with a new book about the corruption in Washington, and he included this chart in his book. This is what he says it costs to become a member of a key committee or a chairman or to end up in a leadership position in the House of Representatives. This is nothing less than the sale of public office for partisan political gain, but the parties do it because that's how they raise the vast sums that they are going to turn around and spend in an election. So the problem is real, and the perception of corruption is real. President Trump rode this perception to victory in November, saying that Hillary Clinton was part of the corruption problem. And Trump summed up what he thought people wanted in 3 words: drain the swamp. He tapped into this feeling, which, as you've seen, is prevalent on both sides of the aisle. He came out with a list of proposals during the campaign to drain the swamp. Here was his campaign set of pledges. He would institute a 5-year ban on all executive branch officials lobbying the government after they left. He would ask Congress to institute its own 5-year ban for members and their staffs. He would expand the definition of lobbyist. He would have a lifetime ban against senior executive branch officials lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. And he would ask Congress to pass campaign finance laws that prevent registered foreign lobbyists from raising money in U.S. elections. Finally, he would push for a constitutional amendment to impose term limits. Now, I am not a fan of term limits, and I would add some other reforms to that list. But the Trump campaign list would be a big first step in the right direction. It would help clean up some of the pay-to-play in Washington and the revolving door that we see. And remember that Trump was constantly attacking the role of money in politics and saying we had to reform campaign finance. So based on all of that, you might think that an outsider was going to Washington to drain the swamp. So now that we're nearly 4 months into the new administration, let's ask, how is the swamp draining going? Well, let me put it this way. The reality is way behind the rhetoric. Or as one of the founders of the Tea Party recently put it, it looks as if we've got the creature from the Black Lagoon in the White House. Now, it's useful to know that after the election, President Trump was asked about draining the swamp, and he said, well, that's just a phrase I heard on the campaign trail. And people liked it at rallies, so I used it. That is not exactly a ringing League of Women Voters commitment to reform. The people the president has hired for his administration have what you might call a distinctly swampy look about them. It turns out that the Trump administration has changed President Obama's restrictions on hiring lobbyists and is bringing in numerous lobbyists to staff the White House and federal agencies. In some cases, these lobbyists are working on the exact same policies on which they had been lobbying. So, while the president has put some limits on what executive branch employees can do going out the door, it's essentially a free-for-all in terms of who is coming in the door. The administration has developed an executive order that imposed some restrictions on people leaving the executive branch. But in other ways, that order is weaker than the version that President Obama had put in place. And it appears that some of the former lobbyists coming into this administration are violating even the restrictions the administration does have in place. We don't know for sure because one of the things the administration has done is to make secret any of the waivers it is giving to administration employees, waivers from their own ethics rules. This is obviously not a positive development, and the Office of Government Ethics has now formally objected to the practice of granting secret waivers to these conflict of interest rules. I think here we have the executive order from the branch where they started to say they were going to clean the swamp before they started to give these secret waivers. The administration's executive order has a second problem. It does nothing to curb the undisclosed shadow lobbying that President Trump said he would eliminate. He has not done anything to require greater disclosure of people who don't register as lobbyists but run lobbying campaigns. This is someone you may have heard of, Carl Icahn. He's a billionaire investor, he's a friend of the president, and he has been named a special advisor to the president. You might wonder what a special advisor does. Well, in that capacity, he has been screening candidates for senior federal jobs and advising the White House on policy for U.S. business. However, he has another capacity, which is he's a private investor. And in that capacity, he's been busy lobbying senior administration officials to remove an EPA rule that is costing his company millions of dollars. Now, normally, this would be a conflict of interest, and he wouldn't be allowed to do that. However, the White House's view is that even though he's been called a special advisor to the president, that is not actually an official government job, so he's not a government employee, and none of the conflict of interest rules apply to him. Nor, of course, has he registered as a lobbyist. All of that is the executive branch side. Congress has done nothing either. President Trump hasn't pushed them to do anything to curb lobbying by former legislators or to prevent lobbyists from coming in and writing the legislation for the industries for whom they lobbied just weeks ago. So I'd say on the drain the swamp agenda, it's at best a incomplete, with no sign that the administration is going to spend time on this going forward. That's partly because the administration has, as you all know, been spending a great deal of time on conflict of interest issues for the first beginning of the administration, starting with whether President Trump would have a blind trust or not, and then as new appointees have come along. They have done this in a context of increasing secrecy. Last month, the administration announced that it would no longer make public the visitor logs to the White House, which was one of the improvements that the Obama administration had made, and it enabled the press and the public to see which lobbyists, who was coming to visit the administration. That is now top secret. So, this, as the New York Times points out, effectively bars the public from knowing which activists, lobbyists, political donors, and others are gaining access to the president and his aides on a daily basis. Then, of course, there's the ongoing debate about whether President Trump should release his tax returns, especially as he pushes for tax reforms that may, or may not, we don't know, benefit him personally. But perhaps the greatest ethics issue for the Trump administration is the Trump family's own conflicts of interest. I won't dwell on this for too long. I know you have read a lot about it, but there are some radically new issues here for people who are used to administrations where ethics has been something they worry about, where the president has a blind trust, where the White House counsel's office job is to make sure there are no suspicions of any unethical behavior. So here is a glamorous couple you will recognize, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, the president's daughter and son-in-law. They are in top White House positions. Now, when this was first suggested, that rumored, trial ballooned, that they might go to the White House, Washington lawyers said, well, they can't do that. Congress passed a law in the 1960s after Bobby Kennedy was appointed Attorney General by his brother. And that law specifically says that you can't appoint your relatives. So you would have thought that that was flatly illegal. However, the Department of Justice and the Trump family lawyers have taken the position that that law applies to agencies, and the White House is not an agency, so it doesn't apply to whomever the president wants to appoint in the White House. But this creative reading of what's known as the anti-nepotism law is not, I think, the biggest issue for the Kushners, because it turns out that they have and still have large businesses of their own. They are now officially federal employees, so unlike the president, they are actually subject to the federal conflict of interest rules, but they own their businesses, they're not running them, and as a result, they have the potential for conflict. Last month, there is a picture of the state dinner given for the Chinese premier. The same day that Ivanka was sitting at the table with the premier in Florida, it was announced that a number of trademark applications she had pending in China had been granted that day in less than half the time it normally takes for the Chinese government to process them, and they have a record of turning down a number of applications. Now, this happy news for Ivanka came not too long after President Trump discovered that he had suddenly received the approval of 38 trademarks from China, and this was after 10 years of fighting over those trademarks, with no sign before he became president that he would ever get any of the trademarks. After the election, 38 were granted. Now, that trademark approval came right after President Trump had called the president of China and had switched his publicly stated position and announced his support for the One China policy, which recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. This sort of narrative is obviously troubling for the possibility that China is favoring Trump businesses over other companies as a way of seeking to influence the President of the United States. But the reality is we have never had a family in the White House with as many ongoing investments and thus as many potential conflicts as this one. The Kushners and their lawyers have taken some steps to address these conflicts, but they still have a personal financial interest in how their companies are doing. I'm sure many of you read this week the articles about the Kushner companies in China selling HB5 visas to investors at a meeting with a big picture of President Trump in the lobby. President Trump himself, meanwhile, has denied that his financial conflicts are a problem, including his very visible investments in countries where the U.S. has troubled relations. The president said, "The president can't have a conflict of interest." Now, what I believe he might have meant to say is the ethics laws do not restrict my many conflicts of interest. He's still getting quarterly updates on the Trump Organization's activities. He put them in a trust. He controls who the trustees are. He can revoke it at any time. And just recently, he changed the terms of his trust so that trustees now have to distribute money to him whenever he asks for it. The Trump Organization is still his personal ATM. The real problem here, of course, the worry, is that when President Trump makes decisions, he may act out of concern for his business interests rather than solely for the national interest. How will we know? The most vivid example of this conflict comes from the president's business connections with foreign governments. Normally, of course, building a global business empire is a very American thing to do, and we all approve of it. But not when the person doing it is the President of the United States. That's why every president for the last 40 years has put their personal business interests in a blind trust or converted them to cash upon assuming office. To give just one recent example of why this is a problem, President Trump called Turkish President Erdogan to congratulate him on the passage of the recent referendum that greatly expands his powers and changes the Turkish constitution. On the same day, the Department of State put out a statement questioning the legitimacy of the referendum based on concerns by European voting observers that ballots had been stuffed and they did not have a level playing field. So you have the president saying one thing to his friend, the president of Turkey, while the U.S. State Department is saying something else. Now, that is a picture of Trump Towers, Istanbul. In 2012, that was opened, and we have Ivanka Trump thanking then Prime Minister Erdogan for coming to the opening, helping to launch it, and major investors in that hotel are close friends and supporters of the President of Turkey. As President Trump himself put it in the campaign, quote, I have a little conflict of interest because I have a major building in Istanbul. So these are the sorts of issues that I think raise serious questions about the president's continued financial interests. That photo is in Manila, and just last week, President Trump surprised the State Department by inviting the president of the Philippines to come to Washington, despite the fact that we have been criticizing his human rights abuses. It may not have hurt that the president of the Philippines named Donald Trump's Philippine business partner as the special Philippine envoy to the United States. Now, the issue here moves from the Ethics in Government Act, which I think everyone agrees does not apply to the president because there were constitutional separation of powers concerns. Who would enforce it? How could the head of the Office of Government Ethics, who is reporting to the president, enforce ethics agreements against the president? But there is another document that clearly applies to the president. That is the Constitution of the United States. And I think you can read that pretty well. No person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state. So that is known as the Emoluments Clause. And not surprisingly, the founders, after the revolution, were very concerned about foreign governments being able to induce the president to take action that would benefit someone else and not the United States, and this was their answer to it. It was designed to play an important role in preventing corruption. The clause has only that one safety valve, which is Congress may grant permission, and it has done so. It has passed an act so that when presidents receive visiting heads of state and they give them a nice little box with wrapping on it, the president is allowed to take it, which otherwise he couldn't do. And the act says the president may take foreign gifts that are given to him in conjunction with state visits. He may display them in the White House during his term of office, and when he leaves, they're the property of the United States. So Congress knew what they were doing, where they were very clear. They never thought of a situation like this, where you would have a president in business around the world. So in sum, I'd say there was a lot of promising discussion during the campaign about cleaning up Washington. But instead, the federal government, I think transparency has gotten worse, lobbying influence has gotten worse, and we have much worse conflict of interest issues. All of those are issues that the group I'm involved with and president of the Campaign Legal Center is working on a daily basis. While we talk about draining the swamp and all of that, I don't want to lose sight of the broader democratic issues, the issues with our democracy that we have in all 50 states. So let me just briefly discuss a couple of those broader problems beyond what's happening right now in Washington with the Trump administration. One of them is the myth of in-person voter fraud, which is the use of restrictions to harm people who should be registered voters and should be able to vote. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about voting restrictions to harm minority voters, partisan gerrymandering, and then I want to conclude on something you may or may not have heard of, which is the drive for a new second constitutional convention. So starting with the myth of in-person voter fraud. We've seen this troubling trend in the last few years where politicians are using the threat of voter fraud, the claim that there is voter fraud, to justify strict photo ID laws. So far this year alone, legislators in 19 states have introduced 30 voter ID bills in all of those states. At first, of course, it sounds unobjectionable to require that people show ID. The devil is in the details. what sort of photo ID, what is ID, what do you do if you don't have a photo ID that's issued by the government? It comes as a surprise to some people to discover that not all Americans have photo IDs. Some people don't drive, so they don't need a driver's license, particularly the elderly and urban residents. Some states say, well, you can show a passport. Well, only about 40% of Americans have a passport, so for many people, that's not an option. Even for those who do have a form of photo ID, many states have rather artfully created rigid restrictions on what kinds of ID voters are allowed to show, designed to make it easy for legislators' supporters to vote and difficult for those who favor the opposition party. Let me give you an example. In Texas, the law the legislature passed says that a concealed weapons permit is a permissible form of photo ID, but a state university-issued student ID is not. So it's not difficult to figure out who is being targeted by these laws: the elderly, the poor, young people, particularly college students. Looking again at an example of Texas, a federal court found that over 600,000 Texans did not have one of the couple forms of voter ID that the state law allowed. It also found that over 30% of the counties in Texas did not have an office where people could go to get a government ID, and that some voters had to travel over 100 miles to get to the nearest motor vehicle office. We know that restrictive photo ID laws prevent some number of eligible voters from voting. There's a study that came out this week saying that as many as 200,000 residents in Wisconsin did not have photo ID. There are estimates that as many as 90,000 of those may not have voted. You may recall the election in Wisconsin was closer than that. So if you look at this carefully, the argument that these are needed to prevent voter fraud also falls apart. This is an interesting chart because here are 4 states that conducted investigations after the 2016 election. Their secretaries of state carefully looked into allegations. On the left side are the total number of possible cases of voter fraud in those states. On the right side is the percentage they constitute of ballots cast. So a tiny percentage. Moreover, and crucially, nearly every one of these examples of possible fraud involve either absentee ballots or accidental voting, people who thought they were eligible but turn out not to be. I'll mention it a little later, but for instance, ex-felons are in many states prohibited from voting, and some of them registered and voted in any case. But what you'll note is none of these, to our knowledge, are in-person impersonization, people who came in without the right ID and voted. That's because if you think about it, it's actually pretty tough to do. You would have to go in, this is presuming you didn't have to show ID, you'd have to know the name of the voter, you'd have to say, I am that person. In my state, they say, and where do you live? So you'd have to have the address and everything else. You'd have to hope that it's not a small town where they know you or know the person whose name you're using. And then you'd have to hope that the real voter doesn't come in later and try to vote, or all hell will break loose. So who is going to risk jail terms, large fines for one vote, if you are lucky to do that? So all studies tend to show that there's almost no in-person voter impersonation fraud, and that is the one thing that a photo ID requirement could actually deal with. Here's one that found 31 potential examples. This is an estimate out of 1 billion votes cast over an entire decade. So the question is, why are legislators pushing these photo ID laws? We know the answer based in part on court testimony, depositions taken in cases fighting these laws, where people generally admitted that they passed the law because their voters had IDs and they thought the other party's voters were more likely not to. So that's the impersonation and the issue of photo ID. The next issue, which I think is fundamentally for us because of our history as a country, even worse, is intentionally discriminatory voting laws. The United States Supreme Court a couple years ago struck down part of the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County on the belief that racial discrimination is a thing of the past. That may be true in some places, but we've unfortunately seen that in many states, legislators are equating racial groups with political parties and passing laws that harm minority voters in an attempt to help themselves politically. To give an example, we at the Campaign Legal Center have been fighting in the courts for years against Texas's photo ID law. Twice now, the district court has ruled that the Texas legislature passed that law with the specific intent to discriminate against Black and Latino voters. We've seen a similar story in North Carolina, where the legislature passed a bill only days after the Supreme Court's voting rights decision. That bill was designed to take away every legislative advance in the election process that had been made over the previous decades by minority voters. Now, that's a fairly serious statement, and I can make it and say that bill was designed to do that because that is what the senior federal court found after looking at the evidence. In the court's ruling that the law was intentionally discriminatory, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said that the provisions, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision. Courts have also found that Pasadena, Texas, Evergreen, Alabama, and the entire Texas state legislature all intentionally discriminated in drawing their most recent redistricting maps. Some other examples of discrimination are not so obvious. One of these, which the Campaign Legal Center is now beginning to concentrate on, is something I mentioned a moment ago, the disenfranchisement of ex-felons. So here is a map showing restrictions on people who have served their jail terms and are now back in the general population. In Iowa, Kentucky, and Florida, being convicted of any felony means that that person cannot vote for the rest of their life. Many other states have disenfranchisement laws for those with felony convictions that go for years after they leave prison. Sometimes these laws were passed with the intent to prevent minorities from voting, and they're very effective at it. The Campaign Legal Center recently brought a case against the state of Alabama, which has a law saying that anyone convicted of a felony involving moral turpitude can forever lose his or her right to vote. Now, you might wonder exactly what moral turpitude is, and if you do, and I do, the answer is we don't really know. The state first started using that term back in 1901, and the United States Supreme Court found that that term was expressly motivated by a desire to discriminate against blacks on account of race, by listing crimes that the legislatures thought black residents would be more likely to commit. So the Supreme Court threw that out in 1985. Amazingly, Alabama has since passed another law on felon disenfranchisement, still using the same phrase. It now claims that it's a new law, and there's no evidence that that law has any racial bias. Meanwhile, and I I wrote this down, and I went and checked it, and I said, it just can't be true. And the answer is, it is. As a result of the law currently on the books in Alabama, 15% of all eligible African American voters in the state are disenfranchised. 15%. The Campaign Legal Center is currently in court trying to overturn that. In many of these cases, racial discrimination has served as a proxy for partisan discrimination. What the legislators say when they're challenged is, we weren't targeting African American voters. We were just targeting Democrats. It's not our fault that in the South they are often one and the same. That is the argument they have offered in court when they're told that whatever they have done has had a disparate adverse effect on African Americans. Then you get to gerrymandering. You can see the blue on that. That's not water. That is a congressional district. The water is out here to the east, but you can see this is a district in Maryland that is, in some places, barely attached to other parts, I guess with the islands not attached, including the capital city, and then wandering around to draw it in a way that was going to give the greatest partisan advantage to the map drawers, who in this case are the Democrats in control of the legislature. Now, the Supreme Court has said that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but it has never figured out how to measure when the gerrymandering is so partisan that it has gone too far. The good news is, in this coming year, the court will have a chance to solve this problem. Right next door, let's see, I think it's that way if I've got my directions right, north of here in Wisconsin, the legislature in 2001 developed one of the most extreme partisan gerrymanders in the country. It was intentionally designed to hurt Democrats, and it did its job very well. 2012, 48% of the people in the state voted for Republicans, who ended up with 61% of the seats in the legislature. 2014, you see it again. Since that election, political scientists have developed a test using a measuring system they call partisan symmetry. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but this turns out not to be that complicated. What you say is that a fair district map would treat the parties equally, so that if you win 50% of the votes as a party across the state, you should end up with about 50% of the seats in the state legislature. To the extent that is off, to the extent you have numbers that look more like that, it is what the political scientists call the efficiency gap. It didn't turn out the way the numbers across the state would argue it should have. The greater the gap, the greater the gerrymandering. So that, here's your efficiency gap as presented to the court. In this case, a federal three-judge court in Wisconsin found that the state's gerrymander was unconstitutional because it was excessively partisan. They cited this test to prove it, and they said to the Supreme Court, we have met your standard. We have produced a test so that we now know when a redistricting plan is in fact an unconstitutional, overly partisan gerrymander. That case is at the Supreme Court now, and I expect it will be argued this fall in the court. So fingers crossed, we may finally be able to do something about gerrymandering if the Supreme Court agrees we have a test we can use to challenge it. Now, finally, this one, and I want to start by saying that the League of Women Voters has been a great leader on this nationally, as has Common Cause, but let me explain what this issue is. Since 1789, when we had our only constitutional convention, every amendment to the Constitution has gone through the process outlined in the Constitution, which is 2/3 of each House of Congress has voted to propose the amendment, and 3/4 of the state legislatures have then ratified it. What you may not know is that Article 5 of the Constitution lays out not only this process, but an alternative process as well. And that says that on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, Congress shall call, this is not optional, a convention for proposing amendments, which shall be valid when ratified by conventions in 3/4 of the states. Now, pausing there for a moment, that tells you that if you have 2/3 of the state calling it, Congress has to call a convention, and 3/4 of the states then have to ratify it. It doesn't tell you much, actually, about how that would work. Who are the delegates to the convention? How do they get chosen? If you have 3/4 of the states, or 2/3 of the states calling for it, do the state legislatures in those states select who goes there? How would that work? There are lots of questions involved in this. But nonetheless, interest groups, to some extent on both sides of the political spectrum, have been pushing for such a convention. There is one proposal for a convention of the states, and here are, in blue, are the states that are considering that, have it. In green are the states that have passed it. A group called Citizens for Self-Government is pushing for this one, and some people who oppose the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision have been supporting this, saying, unless we amend the Constitution, we're never going to undo Citizens United. Meanwhile, the conservative side has been active. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has been pushing model legislation for a constitutional convention specifically to pass a balanced budget amendment. Now, here is the state of play. 28 states have passed some form of a call for a constitutional convention. 34 is what you need. So far this year, Arizona and Wyoming have been added to the 28, and Wisconsin is likely to be. So that would get you to 31 out of 34. However, thanks to the efforts of the League and Common Cause and other groups, 3 other states, New Mexico, Maryland, and Nevada, have rescinded their calls. So we are back down to 28. Well, no matter how you feel about balanced budgets or the power of the federal government, the idea of a new constitutional convention should be worrying, because there really isn't any way to restrict what that convention could do. The framers, of course, you have to remember, were called together to revise the Articles of Confederation, and what they did was throw them out and start again. So there is not a good model for restricting it, and there doesn't seem to be a practical way to do it if the group gathers and decides they also wanted to start from scratch. This has focused attention on both sides of the political spectrum, and there was a very interesting vote earlier this year in Idaho. A left-right coalition, people on the left who were concerned about undoing constitutional civil rights protections, and people on the right who were concerned that a convention might push the Equal Rights Amendment or might fiddle with the Second Amendment gun rights. A coalition formed, and the proposal to call for a convention was defeated in the state Senate 24-11. So I think that is proof that when people think this through, you can have even very conservative legislatures stop and wonder if this is really what they want to do. Now, I have spoken more than long enough to give you lots of thoughts and food for questions. So I will stop and take questions, which I know is going to be organized by the audience, but I want to leave you with a final thought. There we have our founders originally. Democracy is government by the people. And the Supreme Court in 1963 said, "No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which, as good citizens, we must live." Other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. So I would say to all of you tonight, stay informed, stay interested, and stay involved so that we can make our democracy work. Thank you very much.
That's a lot of food for thought. And we have a number of questions from the audience. Are you willing to
Sure.
talk some more to us?
You'll have to give me the hook when you've decided those chairs are too hard and bedtime is calling. So,
Well, I see that in my introduction, I should have stressed your work with the legal.
don't worry.
Thank you, sir.
She has lots
With
of
the-
cards here.
I do.
You may be here a while.
With the Center for Legal.
Campaign Legal Center.
Campaign Legal Center, because much of your talk covered that. So we have really two thrusts of questions, some having to do with campaign finance, some having to do with campaign finance, many having to do with that. And the other area are these electoral issues, everything from redistricting to the Electoral College, as a matter of fact. So why don't we start with campaign finance? There are several on funding or super PAC. What are super PACs good for? And is there, what do you think of the billionaire, the self-financed billionaire as a kind of candidate? And how much influence do you associate with lobbyists as opposed to direct money donors? Now, that's lumping a lot of things together, but let's see if you can sort them out.
Okay. Super PACs are an accident of history and of law. There is no act of Congress that says we're going to have something called a super PAC. First of all, the press calls them super PACs, and we do because the official name, which is a independent, non-connected political action committee that makes only independent expenditures and is therefore allowed to take unlimited corporate money, seems like kind of a long phrase. So, super PACs it is. But what happened is the Supreme Court in Citizens United said, if you make an independent expenditure, it's not corrupting because it's independent of the candidates and parties, therefore you're exercising your First Amendment right, and you can do that. But don't worry, said Justice Kennedy, because it'll be fully disclosed, which it's not, and voters will know who is paying for it, which they don't, and it'll have your name on the ad. So that's where the Supreme Court left it, thinking, I believe, based on that case, that this was going to be Exxon or some other company that you would recognize when it took out the ad. Then along came another federal court that said, well, if independent expenditures aren't corrupting, and you therefore can't limit how much they spend, or the sources of money, which is Citizens United, then you shouldn't be able to limit how much people can give to them. So you could have a political committee, which we now call a super PAC, that can take unlimited amounts from corporations as well as individuals, and then make unlimited expenditures. That case has actually never gone back to the Supreme Court, but it changes things fundamentally because the court thought that a corporation or an individual who would be visible and known would be using their money to talk about candidates, and we'd know who they were and could judge their speech. Instead, all those groups are giving to other entities, either these super PACs that end up spending a huge amount of the money in elections, or the nonprofits that don't even disclose their donors. So you end up with a group we've never heard of, Americans for a Better Country, spending a great deal of money. Either their donors are secret or they're reported to the FEC, but you and I don't know how to find that and what to look for when you see an ad by Americans for a Better Country. So the result is we've ended up with a very different system than the Supreme Court said we were going to have by accident, and no one has done anything about it. And the problem is once you've got the genie out of the bottle, it's very hard to put the genie back. Everyone has gotten used to these. Candidates now form their own super PACs. Remember, they're independent, non-coordinated. They have nothing to do with candidates. So the candidates say to their best friend or their brother-in-law, go form a super PAC. I can't have anything to do with it, except the Federal Election Commission has said that if you have a fundraiser, I'm allowed to come to it, and I'm allowed to thank you for doing this, and I'm allowed to tell you what an important job you're doing. I just can't ask you for money. So we've ended up in a very different place than we were supposed to. I don't know now how we're going to go back to where the Supreme Court thought we would be, but we're in a world of unlimited, often secret, corporate money from individuals, and corporations and individuals. That leads to the billionaire question. There are a couple thoughts on that. We're a free country. If people want to run for office, fine. I think, though, as a democracy, we have a basic obligation to ensure that candidates can be heard. And if you have one candidate who's a billionaire and can spend an unlimited amount of money and does so, and the other candidate is a school teacher and has to raise money in small individual contributions, you have a very uneven race. And I don't think our founders thought we were going to have an aristocracy of wealth. They thought we were going to have an aristocracy of talent, and that, in their world, you didn't have to have great wealth to become noticed in the state legislature, to have your neighbors know you and send you to Congress. We've changed as elections have gotten much more expensive, but we have ended up in a place where millionaires, billionaires are greatly favored. A couple years ago, I was asked to have a conversation. It was styled a debate in Washington, and the person, this was put together with a member of the British House of Lords, and we were supposed to talk about the differences between our political systems and what we each saw as the advantage of our system. So I thought, well, this is going to be a piece of cake. I mean, particularly, forgive me, but when I discovered that the member of the British House of Lords was a baroness who was in her late 80s, I thought, well, I can deal with this, and she's going to talk about the House of Lords and how wonderful it is, and I'll talk about American democracy. So she got up there and looked at me and said, I'm so pleased to be here today because Mr. Potter can explain something that I do not understand. In my country, we think that all citizens have the right and the potential to participate in government. In your country, you seem to think that only the very wealthy should participate in government. Can you tell me why you only want such a small percentage of your population to be in government? And I thought, I surrender. There is no way to answer that. I only later discovered that she'd been an actress before she went into politics, so it was a very unfair fight. But it's a great point. If you look at us from somewhere else in Britain, there are plenty of wealthy people in politics, but they're not there because they're wealthy, and their wealth doesn't actually enable them to buy an election. There are limits on how much they can spend as well as everyone else. There's public TV time that is given to parties, and we've just gone a different route. I can understand saying that you don't want to restrict how much an individual spends of their own money and calling that free speech. But the effect of that, then, is you have to come up with some other way to finance the candidates who are not billionaires. And we have not found that. And the result of that is, if you go talk to the party committees, they'll be very honest, and they'll tell you that their ideal candidate is somebody who can write a check and finance their own election campaign, because then they don't have to worry about fundraising for them. They don't have to figure out if they're any good at fundraising. Well, that's a problem because it means the parties are recruiting, by definition, from a very small segment of society. And then you turn around and look at those numbers we talked about of the percentage of Americans who think they're not being represented in Washington, and it's not necessarily a surprise. To me, one of the interesting things of this election was how Donald Trump managed to portray himself as the man of the people outsider while being the only billionaire in the race. But that was effective because he could make the pitch that he wasn't going to be bought by anybody. And people found that appealing given what they were seeing in the election system, which was all these super PACs and all these special interests spending money to elect people.
Okay, I've got a clutch of questions that touch on Citizens United and related questions of campaign fundraising. A very lengthy and thoughtful question about polls regularly reveal Americans on both the political right and the political left oppose the Citizens United decision, and goes on to ask a number of questions that people don't, they state that people don't believe that money is equivalent to speech. The specific questions asked are, why does this general view not have support in Congress? Has anyone drafted what could become the text of an amendment to amend the Constitution in order to overcome the effect of Citizens United? And how can citizens persuade their elected representatives to support a constitutional amendment? Others ask, another one asked, do any of the Citizens United reforms have a chance of passing? And then there are a couple of, let me let you answer those two.
So I'd start by saying that I think Citizens United was a terrible decision, that it was not thought through by the court, and in many ways it was sort of a put-up job. This is a case that went to the court with many exit ramps. The Supreme Court's basic doctrine is it will not declare an act of Congress unconstitutional if there was a way around that. And here, they could have interpreted the statute so that they didn't declare the act of Congress unconstitutional. They chose not to do so. There were 5 justices who absolutely wanted to get to this case, and they wanted to say corporations could spend money in American politics. In doing so, they overturned, depending on how you count, either 100 years of precedent or only 50 years of precedent, because since 1907, it has been illegal for corporations to give money to candidates and parties in federal elections. And since the 1940s, it has been illegal for corporations and unions to spend money in elections. So that's what the Supreme Court was overturning. And they did so, of course, only 5-4. It had gone the other way. There were only 4 votes for allowing corporations to do that when the McCain-Feingold law first got to the court after it was passed. But then Justice O'Connor retired, Justice Alito took her seat, and he felt exactly the other way. So the court flipped, and it looked as if those 5 justices were in a rush to make this decision before anyone else left, and it flipped back again. So what they said was that corporations, for First Amendment purposes, for political speech and campaign purposes, are effectively just collections of individuals, associations of individuals, and they should have the same rights as an actual voter has. I thought that was wrong in the sense that corporations are artificial entities. As the lawyers in the audience know, you have to go and create it by an act of government, and they have, unlike individuals, they don't have any natural death. They go forever. They have advantages under the tax laws in being able to amass capital, which individuals don't have in the same way. So it seemed to me they weren't voters. They had all these special privileges. They were created as an artificial entity, and they shouldn't be allowed to participate as if they were full citizens. And I thought that made sense on a policy ground because everyone in this room has economic interests. There's no question about it. You care about your tax rate, you care about your savings, you care about what the government is doing to you economically. But you also have cultural interests, family issues, patriotic interests. It might benefit you if you own a defense contractor for us to go to war in Korea. But the other side of your brain and of your interests says, gee, a war in Korea is probably not what I want. So you have a well-rounded view as a citizen. Corporations don't have that well-rounded view. Their job is to make money for their shareholders, and if they can do something that is bad for America but good for the shareholders, generally we see that's what they do. And for that reason, it seemed to me, giving corporations a great deal of clout in elections was a mistake, because they're not well-rounded citizens with the same interests. Now, the argument the other way, made by particularly Justice Scalia, was, well, but not all corporations are Exxon, or any of these huge multinationals. The corner barber shop may be incorporated for liability purposes, and the barber, therefore, can't, as the Barbershop Inc., put a campaign for a candidate or write a corporate check to a party. So the argument was they're really small people from the conservatives, and no, they are gluttonous multinationals from the liberals. So that was the back and forth. The question then becomes, now that the court has done this and said that corporations have the same rights as individuals, could it be undone, and how? It could be undone by a change in the court, a change in justices. It could be undone by proof that the court was wrong, that there actually is corruption here that's coming from these large corporate expenditures. And I think with the world of super PACs and dark money, we're getting closer to being able to make that argument. The constitutional amendment, I think, is a tough one. First of all, it's certainly easier to change one justice on the court than it is to amend the Constitution. Secondly, you would be amending the First Amendment. And as a lawyer and a citizen, it makes me nervous when you start playing with the First Amendment. And it's also hard to draft that. The two versions tend to be one that very specifically says the Supreme Court was wrong and corporations do not have a right to participate in elections. So you could do that. But then you say, well, what about the New York Times? Isn't it an incorporation? Isn't CBS Inc.? So you say, well, yeah, but we're not talking about the press. So then you say, well, corporations can't participate, except institutions of the press or something like that. So then you start saying, well, what are institutions of the press? What happens if GM buys a magazine? Can GM now be an institution? It's hard to write this in a way that is as narrow as you want. So the other alternative is, oh, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say, we're going to trust Congress, and the amendment's going to say, Congress may make laws regulating the spending of money in elections, period. Well, that's easy to write, but then you get nervous. What is Congress going to do? And will we like what they're going to do? So I think the constitutional amendment is a difficult route to take, plus very hard to pass. So what we're doing at the Campaign Legal Center is trying to build a legal record to go to the courts and show where corruption is actually occurring. Starting with, and this goes back to something I said earlier, the Supreme Court had no idea that our elections were going to look like this. The case is only 7 years old. They envisioned a completely different world. This spending was going to be completely independent of candidates. It's not. It could be. You could pass laws that would be fully constitutional under Citizens United that said candidates can't be involved in super PACs, they can't raise money, their campaign manager can't go run the super PAC, all these things we've seen happen. That could be done without changing the Constitution at all. So you could say they have to be fully independent. Then you could say it has to be fully disclosed, so we actually know the sources. I think you could undo super PACs and say only individuals or corporations as themselves have the right to do this speech, and they have to put their name on the ad so we know who they are. That if you give to a super PAC, that's a contribution that can be limited. So I think there are ways to go at this that would undo a lot of the damage of Citizens United. The issue is going to be, can you get it through Congress? Not this Congress. And even disclosure, which the court said was going to happen, when it was clear it was not going to happen, Congress was deadlocked on a partisan basis. And the Chamber of Commerce and other groups went to the Republican leadership and said, you can't pass a Disclosure Act because if our members have to say they're giving money to defeat particular candidates or elect others, their shareholders will be unhappy, their consumers will be unhappy, they won't give us the money. So we've had a deadlock on Congress on that, but that's a political issue, not a legal one, and that could be solved by enough voter anger.
We have a number of questions that link the political and campaign finance. One one asks about how can states, thinking specifically about Illinois, this questioner, but how can states get rid of partisan redistricting, partisan districting?
The answer of that is we can make sure the Supreme Court upholds the 3-judge decision in Wisconsin, because if they do, they will then have said partisan redistricting, gerrymandering is unconstitutional. There is at least one test, maybe others, that courts can use to identify it, and when they have identified it, they can prohibit it from happening. And that would work in Illinois as well as Wisconsin and elsewhere. So we need the court to uphold that test, and it's specifically Justice Kennedy who this case is aimed at, because he has said, I think partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but I don't know how to define it. If you can come up with a test, then I'm willing to apply it. That is what he said, and this is the test that we hope he will acknowledge as a legitimate one.
So what are your thoughts on churches being able to financially back a candidate?
So part of the push from the religious right has been to become more active in politics, and they are frustrated by the fact that federal law prohibits charities, 501c3s, which include churches, from intervening in elections, which means going out and campaigning, endorsing candidates, taking out ads, etc. My own sense is, first of all, that charitable, tax-exempt money that we all are paying for, in the sense that if someone gives to it, they get a tax deduction, their taxes are lower and everyone else's go up, that money ought not to be used for elections unless you want to have something like a public funding system. But to favor some sources of money over others by saying churches can do that and get a tax deduction seems to me a policy error. It also would really open the door to secret money, because churches and C3s don't disclose their donors. And if you could not only secretly spend money in politics, but get a tax deduction for doing so, there would be plenty of people who would be very happy to do it. As someone who goes to church and always bridles when the minister starts talking politics, I don't think it's a good thing for churches to be encouraged and enticed to go into the political battlefield. The one area that it seems to me, if people were serious about this, there is a compromise, would be to be clear that the government doesn't regulate and shouldn't regulate what people say in a church service. So if you happen to go to a church where the minister wants to talk about an election or a candidate, I think that's where I draw the line and say that's not the government's business, as opposed to when they go out and spend money for advertising or to get out voters or something like that. So I would agree that whatever is said from the pulpit is not the expenditure of money and not an IRS problem. But when the church or any other charity starts spending tax-exempt money outside, that I think is a mistake. I doubt Congress is going to change that law. We'll see. But I think they will recognize that this is opening up a can of worms. President Trump signed a religious freedom order the other day with great fanfare, and then all of us who were interested read it and said, but it doesn't do anything. What it said was the IRS shall recognize religious freedom and liberty and shall allow political activity by churches to the extent permitted by law. And since the law prohibits it, for the moment, I think that's where things sit unless Congress actually moves on it.
Can you take one more?
Let's do one last one.
One more. You're
Have a good one.
hard-working one. Well, I have many good ones here. It's hard to choose. Someone has said all of this is very interesting and very worrisome. What do you think are the three most important or effective things that we, meaning us, ordinary people, can do to turn the tide?
A good question. I would start by saying that I think leagues around the country are terrifically important, as are other civic organizations, collections of people who are willing to come out on a beautiful night when you could be doing a lot of other things because you care about these issues, and then to go home and to talk to your family and your friends and your neighbors. I think we're seeing a real upsurge in civic interest and civic activism following the election. And I think the American people, when aroused, can make an enormous difference. So the first thing I would say is supporting groups like the League and other local civic groups really is important. The second, and this comes as something of a veteran of Washington, having seen grassroots, grass tops, all sorts of lobbying, is members of Congress actually do care when they hear from constituents. It takes effort, but a phone call, a letter, an email, particularly if it looks like it's not a mass-produced one all saying the same thing, gets listened to. I'm sure Senator Stevenson would have stronger views on this or more complete ones, but my impression always is that when a staffer comes into a member of Congress and says, I don't know what's going on out there, but we got 200 letters yesterday, or the phones are ringing off the hook and people can't get into us, and they're all upset about this vote coming up. It matters. They listen. At the end of the day, they need the voters. They need their constituents. And if it's always loud, that's different. But if it's just rolling along and all of a sudden there's a whole big noise and people are writing about something and they're riled up, and I would say this applies to the town hall meetings, except as we know, many members of Congress are now avoiding town hall meetings because they don't like what they're hearing, and they think that the meetings are being rigged and the opposition is bringing in people, which is undoubtedly happening. So if you can't go to a meeting, the phone call, the letter, and so forth, I think really makes a difference. So those would be the two, the being part of local organizations and then actually reaching out, whether it's the state legislature or in Washington, and getting people to contact their representatives. It's hugely effective. I guess the third one I'd say is that we need to think through some of these basic issues. We can't keep going along the way we are. So the work that Senator Stevenson explained that the Stevenson Institute is initiating, there are other groups that are doing it. I know that the League and Common Cause and others are involved with that. The work that my group, the Campaign Legal Center, is doing on the legal side to say, how do we undo Citizens United? How do we think through and plan where we want to be? Because the system we have today was not designed by anybody. It's sort of like Swiss cheese. It's the result of Congress having done one thing, the courts having pulled it apart, the Federal Election Commission not enforcing the laws that are on the books, and we have ended up with a non-system. We have ended up with a series of practices. People look at it and say, why did Congress ever do that? Create super PACs. Well, as I've explained, Congress didn't create super PACs. So we need to step back and think through a coherent system of how we would like our elections to work. What are our values here? If If, like the Baroness from the British House of Lords, we think a value is that the average citizen should be able to get into politics and run for office, then we need to design a system where they can do that, where they're going to be able to fund a campaign, where they're going to be able to communicate. If we think people ought to have easy access to voting, then we need to look at states that have systems that work and say that's our model, rather than a system where people find it hard to go to the polls, the lines are long, they didn't bring the right kind of ID, they didn't register in time because the registration closed 6 months before the election, all these things that happen out there. So I think we need to step back and encourage efforts and work on efforts to say, how would we like our democracy to be organized? Because there will come a moment, I'm convinced, when we'll have a chance to change the rules, and we need to have a plan of how it ought to work and what the values ought to be, what works in other countries. I mean, one of the things that, as I observe foreign elections, I'm aware of, is that we go overseas and we preach all sorts of things that we don't practice here. We go over there and say, well, the elections shouldn't be run by the political parties, they should be run by nonpartisan administrators, there ought to be a national voter registration system. You know, we don't do those things, but we've discovered that they're effective. So to assemble that collection, I think at this stage is important and to wait for the moment to put it in effect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, you've clearly given us a great deal to think about. I think we all learned a great deal. I certainly did. I'd like to tell the audience that if you'd like to see this again, in order to get a full grip on it, it'll be shown on Lake Forest TV. We've got someone from Lake Forest TV here, Ed Johnson, filming it, and you'll have a chance to look at it again and review some of the arguments. And I think that I urge you to do that. I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved, notably you. You gave us a great deal, as I said, to think about. I'd like to thank the Stevensons and the work that they do with the Stevenson Center on Democracy. And I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters and all those volunteers who have been working here, particularly Joy Guskott-Mueller, and who helped put this program, did a great deal to put this program together, and Sharon Borg, who has helped gather the volunteers. But to all of them and to all of you for coming, we thank you very much.
I assume someone will come turn this off because I have no idea.
Yeah, we don't have to.